It's hard to imagine that the very first humans on Earth were forced to marry their own siblings, creating an entire lineage from just one couple. But what if I told you that the daughters of Adam and Eve not only existed, but also carried a dark destiny, rarely mentioned in sermons and almost forgotten in religious traditions? This is the forbidden side of humanity's origin, where faith, necessity, and divine judgment intersect. Get ready. What we're about to reveal might shock you, but it will also answer one of the greatest biblical questions of all time. If you love diving deep into biblical stories most people overlook, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel. Genesis 5-4 states that Adam had sons and daughters, but it doesn't name them or tell their stories. By only naming Cain, Abel, and later Seth, the text doesn't deny the existence of sisters. It simply doesn't highlight them. This passage is straightforward, but doesn't explain where she came from, immediately puzzling modern readers. If there were no other humans, who was Cain's wife? The inevitable conclusion is that she was one of his sisters. The text, if read carefully, points to this unspoken yet uncomfortable reality. This may have been for narrative, theological, or cultural reasons, but it doesn't diminish their important role biologically and historically. Humanity was just beginning, and the moral, social, and genetic laws we know today had not yet been established. The biblical taboo against incest only appears later with the law of Moses, hundreds of years afterward. In Adam's time, marrying a sister was an unavoidable necessity to fulfill God's purpose to multiply and fill the earth. This omission pushes the daughters into the background, even though their existence was obviously essential for humanity to continue. In a world where Adam and Eve were the only original couple, and their sons multiplied, it's clear that daughters existed too, even if the main text ignores them. And comment below, do you believe Adam and Eve really had daughters? Let's discover the truth behind this mysterious story together. The Genesis account, Sons and Silence. Human history begins with Adam and Eve, created by God in the Garden of Eden. According to the Book of Genesis, Adam was formed from the dust of the ground, and Eve was created from one of his ribs, establishing the very first family. The Bible immediately highlights the birth of two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain, the firstborn, became a farmer, while Abel was a shepherd. These names are central to the early chapters of human history. While any mention of daughters is noticeably absent at this stage, this silence about Adam and Eve's daughters raises intriguing questions. The Bible's earliest chapters focus on the male lineage, a common practice in ancient cultures where genealogies emphasized patriarchs. When Cain is cursed by God after killing Abel, he flees and later knew his wife. Though marriage between siblings is repulsive by today's standards, it was not forbidden at that time. Humanity was just beginning, and the moral, social, and genetic laws we know today had not yet been established. The biblical taboo against incest only appears later with the law of Moses, hundreds of years afterward. Adam lived 930 years, and although Eve's death isn't recorded, she likely lived a long life as well. The birth of the sons, the silence about the daughters, and the initial formation of humanity reveal not only a beginning, but also a dilemma. How could the holiness and divine plan be preserved in a world that had to multiply from just one couple? The answer seems to rest precisely in the forgotten figure of these daughters, anonymous women who bore the fate of all humanity within them. This ancient text, valued in some Jewish and Ethiopian traditions, names one of Adam and Eve's daughters Awan or Kalmana, described as Cain's wife. Although not part of the official biblical canon, the Book of Jubilees provides detailed information about these forgotten sons and daughters, adding color and context to the sparse biblical narrative. Considering the time span and the absence of birth control, it's reasonable to assume they had dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of sons and daughters over the centuries. Thus, marriages between siblings, nieces, nephews, and first cousins were for a long time the only way to continue the human race. She becomes a tragic and enigmatic figure, wife of the first murderer in history, mother of Enoch, and co-founder of the first recorded city. Also named Enoch, the command to be fruitful and multiply had to be fulfilled, and Adam and Eve's descendants, even as siblings, had to marry among themselves. This practice, now considered repulsive, was accepted and even necessary at humanity's beginning. It was not about immorality, but survival and fulfilling the divine purpose. The name Awan in some traditions carries meanings like iniquity or strength, a subtle irony given her connection to Cain's sin. In Adam's time, marrying a sister was an unavoidable necessity to fulfill God's purpose to multiply and fill the earth. Bible scholars and theologians support this view when analyzing the timeline of events. The book of Genesis, while concise, carries deep symbolic and historical meaning. After being cursed by God for murdering his brother Abel, Cain was banished from God's presence and went to live in the land of Nod, east of Eden. It is at this point in the biblical narrative that we encounter one of Genesis' greatest mysteries. Although their names are not mentioned, the Bible states that Adam had sons and daughters, which implies the presence of women among the direct descendants of the first couple. Because the Bible focuses on central events and key figures in the redemptive story, these female names were simply left out, but their presence was essential. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. The passage is straightforward, but leaves behind a flood of questions. Who was this woman? Where did she come from? How could there be anyone outside Adam and Eve's family? The most widely accepted and solid answer among scholars is that Cain married one of his sisters. Extra-biblical traditions, such as the Book of Jubilees, considered apocryphal, seek to fill this gap. Awan, the matriarch of Cain's lineage according to this tradition, Awan was given to Cain as his wife after his exile, symbolizing not only the continuation of the lineage, but also the burden of her husband's past. The union between Cain and Awan can be seen in the context of the time as inevitable. There were no alternatives. The command to be fruitful and multiply had to be fulfilled, and Adam and Eve's descendants, even as siblings, had to marry among themselves. This practice, now considered repulsive, was accepted and even necessary at humanity's beginning. It was not about immorality, but survival and fulfilling the divine purpose. It's interesting to note that after Cain's union with his wife, he built a city, the first urban mention in Scripture. This indicates the population was growing and that there was enough structure and organization to form communities. In Genesis 4:25, we read, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew." This symbolism seems to reflect her role, joining Seth and bearing descendants who would remain close to God. The Bible states in Genesis 4:26, "And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord." This verse is crucial, marking the formal beginning of organized public worship of God, something that had been lost since Cain's crime. Enosh thus becomes a symbol of renewed connection with the Creator, a link between the chaos of the previous generation and the spirituality of a new era. Some traditions describe Azura as having been betrothed to Abel before his death, making her a figure marked both by sorrow and new beginnings. While Cain's descendants are noted for cultural and technological achievements, such as creating musical instruments and mastering iron and bronze, Seth's line is associated with righteousness, obedience, and the pursuit of God. In Genesis 5, we find the famous genealogy of the antediluvians, tracing the line from Seth to Noah. This lineage includes men who lived for centuries: Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and finally Noah, God's chosen to preserve creation during the flood. All these patriarchs had Azura as a silent yet indispensable matriarch. This subtle but consistent distinction runs throughout the early chapters of the Bible, can be interpreted in two ways, either as a detail not deemed important enough to highlight, or as a deliberately hidden element due to the sensitive nature of sibling marriage. The biblical text, however, remains concise. Although it mentions Seth's descendants, it does not name his wife. Once again, the Book of Jubilees stands out by filling this gap, naming Seth's wife as Azura, another daughter of Adam and Eve. Like Awan, Azura would have married her own brother, a practice accepted in humanity's early context. This union was not only legitimate, but also necessary to fulfill God's plan. In any case, this woman, though unnamed in Scripture, was responsible for continuing Cain's lineage, a line later marked by artists, metalworkers, and city dwellers, but also by a growing distance from God. Cain's wife, therefore, was not just a spouse and mother, but also a matriarch of a people who were beginning to leave nomadic life behind and lay the foundations of human civilization. The Bible's choice not to name Cain's wife, mentioning her simply as a fact, Azura. The spiritual hope in Seth's line, after the tragedy of Abel's murder and Cain's exile, the Bible records the birth of Seth, the third named son of Adam and Eve. Seth's birth was not just a replacement in number. He symbolized a fresh start for the righteous lineage, a new spiritual hope for humanity's future. The name Azura, of Semitic origin, is often linked to the celestial blue or the precious stone lapis lazuli, evoking purity, beauty, and a spiritual connection to the divine. From the union of Seth and Azura came Enosh, the grandson of Adam and Eve. The lineage of Seth and Azura distinctly differs from that of Cain. Even without directly naming Azura, the biblical text allows Seth's lineage to flourish. In Genesis 5, we find the famous genealogy of the antediluvians, tracing the line from Seth to Noah. This lineage includes men who lived for centuries: Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and finally Noah, God's chosen to preserve creation during the flood. All these patriarchs had Azura as a silent yet indispensable matriarch. Azura represents, alongside Seth, the renewal of God's plan after the corruption brought by Cain. God had not yet established the Mosaic laws that would later prohibit these unions for moral and genetic reasons. This population growth allowed the emergence of cities, villages, and an early social structure. The most accepted explanation among Christian scholars is that Adam and Eve's genetic code was perfect, without the degenerative mutations accumulated over the ages. These patriarchs married women who were probably cousins, nieces, or distant sisters, keeping the lineage within the same family structure. It was a small but rapidly growing society where close blood relations were not an obstacle, but an inevitable trait of humanity as foundation. With each generation, the population grew exponentially. The land of Nod, where Cain fled, became inhabited, and other regions were occupied by Adam's children and grandchildren. Within a few generations, hundreds, perhaps thousands of humans were spread across the region. And amid it all, the forgotten daughters of Adam and Eve remained the silent mothers of a civilization born between the sacred and the conflict. This allowed siblings to marry without the risk of deformities or hereditary diseases. Over time, as genetic imperfections accumulated, God then established prohibitions through Mosaic law. Scholars, estimating based on the long antediluvian lifespans, suggest that Adam and Eve could have had between 50 and 100 sons and daughters. The lack of birth control combined with extreme longevity meant a single woman could have dozens of children during her fertile years. This fertility was considered a direct blessing from God, a sign of obedience and prosperity. Families became true communities, forming the foundation of the first human civilizations. In the world just beginning, necessity outweighed modern ethical standards. Even Abraham, the patriarch of faith, married his half-sister Sarah, a detail that shows how these practices continued centuries after Adam. These consanguineous marriages were not scandalous. On the contrary, they were fundamental alliances to strengthen tribes, protect family bloodlines, and obey God's plan for humanity's propagation. Her role, though little remembered, was essential in restoring order and the righteous lineage of humanity in a time when women's names were often omitted due to cultural conventions. Her appearance in extra-biblical sources offers a fresh perspective on the strength and influence of Eve's daughters, women who literally carried the future of the human race. The antediluvian world, longevity and population growth. As the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve multiplied, humanity began to expand. The Bible records that Adam lived 930 years, which gave him time to father many descendants. For centuries, these generations married among themselves, a practice unthinkable today, but in that context, not only common but essential. Brothers, sisters, nephews, and nieces joined in marriage to fulfill the divine command: be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. Marriage between siblings and close relatives was not condemned in antediluvian times. The generations of Seth and Azura, Cain and Awan multiplied in parallel, building clans that over time would become peoples and nations. The generations arising from these close-kin marriages did not show the genetic problems we know today. It is in this context that figures like Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, and Jared appear, all direct descendants of Seth's righteous lineage. These patriarchs married women who were probably cousins, nieces, or distant sisters, keeping the lineage within the same family structure. It was a small but rapidly growing society where close blood relations were not an obstacle, but an inevitable trait of humanity as foundation. With each generation, the population grew exponentially. The land of Nod, where Cain fled, became inhabited, and other regions were occupied by Adam's children and grandchildren. Within a few generations, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of humans were spread across the region. And amid it all, the forgotten daughters of Adam and Eve remained the silent mothers of a civilization born between the sacred and the conflict. The Bible states that in the days of Enosh, son of Seth, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Here we have the first sign of a moral division between the two lines. Cain's lineage turned toward culture and city building, Seth's lineage toward worship and faith. The women of these lines, Awan and Azura, become silent yet opposing figures in their purposes. One linked to exile and judgment, the other to restoration and hope. The first cities and unnamed matriarchs, they are figures who shaped humanity's destiny without ever having a voice in Scripture. And it is precisely this mystery that has attracted scholars, theologians, and curious minds over the centuries. After all, who were these women? What were their personalities, their roles at home, their views on the events marking the world's beginning? Even in later genealogical records, women are rarely mentioned, except for a few central figures like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. However, without the silent efforts of these first mothers of humanity, no genealogy would have been written. The cities, the flocks, the instruments, and even the sacrifices to God all passed through female hands. And perhaps it is in this silence that they became even more powerful. After Cain settled in the land of Nod, the Bible records that he knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Then Cain founded a city and named it after his son. This is a significant milestone, the emergence of the first city in the biblical narrative. However, once again, the woman who made this lineage possible remains unnamed. She is simply referred to as Cain's wife, while the city carries the name of their son. This omission reinforces the pattern seen throughout the early chapters of Genesis. The daughters of Adam and Eve, though fundamental to humanity's survival, remain invisible in the official records. Without their actions, there would be no posterity. Yet the narrative focuses on men, on male names, on patriarchs. The silence about biblical matriarchs is as telling as the stories that were written. It is precisely in this silence that texts like the Book of Jubilees regain importance. In this apocryphal work, we learn that Cain's wife may have been Awan or Quima, and that he established his own lineage parallel to the children of Seth. The city Cain founded did not arise from nothing. It was built on the shoulders of the women who bore children, raised them, and helped organize family life. These women, though officially unrecognized, were foundational to human society. They were the first teachers, healers, artisans, and homemakers. The city of Enoch represents not only the birth of urbanization, but also the beginning of organized culture. Cain's descendants, such as Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain, became nomadic herders, musicians, and metalworkers. These skills indicate a growing, structured people with the capacity for innovation. Yet each of these men also had a mother, a forgotten woman who made their birth possible and taught them life's first lessons. Meanwhile, the lineage of Seth followed a more spiritual path. The absence of direct accounts about these daughters of Eve does not diminish their importance. On the contrary, it makes them even more intriguing. They are figures who shaped humanity's destiny without ever having a voice in Scripture. And it is precisely this mystery that has attracted scholars, theologians, and curious minds over the centuries. After all, who were these women? What were their personalities, their roles at home, their views on the events marking the world's beginning? Even in later genealogical records, women are rarely mentioned except for a few central figures like Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. Brothers married sisters, cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. It was the only viable model to fulfill the divine commandment. It was only centuries later, during Moses' time, that the prohibition of marriages between close relatives was established. As we read in Leviticus 18, this change reflected population growth and the emergence of more significant genetic risks. However, without the silent efforts of these first mothers of humanity, no genealogy would have been written. The genealogies preserved in Genesis indicate that families were organized, had leadership and purpose. Patriarchs such as Methuselah, Lamech, and Enoch fathered children over centuries, and many of them also built lineages that later gave rise to kings, prophets, and entire peoples. Once again, although their names are not mentioned, women were the silent foundations of this development. Therefore, when the Bible casually states that Adam had sons and daughters, what lies behind that phrase is a vastness of life, birth, pain, nurture, and legacy. Each of these daughters had a crucial role in building humanity, even if forgotten in the texts. Their destiny was shared between obedience to necessity, the silence of history, and the burden of continuing an entire race. The cities, the flocks, the instruments, and even the sacrifices to God all passed through female hands. And perhaps it is in this silence that they became even more powerful. The longevity factor and genetic purity. When we analyze the generations that came from Adam and Eve, one detail stands out profoundly: the longevity of the antediluvian patriarchs. Adam lived 930 years, his son Seth 912, and his grandson Enosh 905. In just a few generations, the number of human beings alive on earth could have reached thousands. And behind this multiplication were the women, daughters of Adam and Eve, who spent their lives bearing and raising children in a continuous cycle of fertility and continuity. The absence of serious diseases, the genetic purity, and the divine blessing of the initial creation created an environment where bodies were strong and enduring. There were no accumulated mutations that today affect our DNA. The structure of life was different. Women reached fertile age early, remained fertile for centuries, and had their health preserved for long periods. This further increased the number of children a single woman could bear throughout her life. According to some estimates by scholars, Adam and Eve alone could have had more than 100 children. Considering their nearly 1,000-year lifespans and continuous fertility, these estimates are not exaggerated if we remember that in antiquity, common women could have between 10 and 15 children, even with a much shorter life expectancy. In the antediluvian world, where infant mortality and childbirth risks were minimal compared to later times, birth rates were very high. These numbers recorded in Genesis 5 were not symbolic to the ancient Hebrews. They point to a time when humans lived for centuries. This radically transformed family and social dynamics. With so many years of life, a single couple could have dozens of children and see not only their grandchildren, but also their great-grandchildren and even more distant descendants. This context of longevity contributed to rapid population growth. Contrary to what many imagine, the pre-flood world was not composed of just half a dozen people. In this scenario, consanguineous marriages became not only acceptable, but a structuring part of early society. The multiplication of humanity did not occur chaotically. The genealogies preserved in Genesis indicate that families were organized, had leadership and purpose. Patriarchs such as Methuselah, Lamech, and Enoch fathered children over centuries, and many of them also built lineages that later gave rise to kings, prophets, and entire peoples. Once again, although their names are not mentioned, women were the silent foundations of this development. Therefore, when the Bible casually states that Adam had sons and daughters, what lies behind that phrase is a vastness of life, birth, pain, nurture, and legacy. Each of these daughters had a crucial role in building humanity, even if forgotten in the texts. Awan and Azura are the silent pillars that supported these lineages. The name Awan, linked to the idea of iniquity, carries the weight of exile and consequence. The name Azura, associated with heaven and purity, symbolizes the promise of restoration. Both embody in themselves the dichotomy between fall and redemption. The fact that these names appear only in apocryphal texts and not in the biblical canon does not diminish their symbolic and historical relevance. On the contrary, it highlights how the women of the Bible were relegated to silence, despite being essential. They are fundamental pieces in the machinery of the divine plan, but often portrayed only as secondary characters or forgotten between the lines. The case of Adam and Eve as daughters is the greatest example. They were at the origin of everything, yet the world hardly knows who they were. Their destiny was shared between obedience to necessity, the silence of history, and the burden of continuing an entire race, and building homes amid a land marked by curses, promises, and disputes. They had no choice, no laws, no alternatives, only the biological and spiritual mission to multiply life. They were the first to endure the pains of childbirth, the challenges of motherhood, and the hope of a better future born with each new child. The twin sisters. A deeper look at Cain and Abel, the Genesis narrative follows two distinct paths from the children of Adam and Eve. Cain's line, marked by blood and the city, and Seth's line, identified by worship and the righteous lineage. When we observe these two lines, we realize that both were born of women whose names were not preserved in the Bible, but without whom none of these stories would exist. It is they, the daughters of Eve, who carried in their wombs the builders of the two great streams of humanity. The lineage of Cain was associated with culture, music, metalwork, and also violence. His descendants, like Lamech, already exhibited polygamous behavior and vengeful words. Behind these men were women who raised children, educated, supported families, and witnessed the gradual distancing from God. These women, though never mentioned, were the first to see faith fading in the following generation's witnesses to what happens when civilization grows, but obedience falters. On the other hand, Seth's lineage maintained a closer commitment to spirituality. Enosh, Seth's grandson, was the first to call upon the name of the Lord. Later came Enoch, who walked with God and was no more, because God took him away, and Noah, the preacher of righteousness, whose faith preserved humanity from judgment. These lineages reveal the tension between the man who builds with his hands and the one who seeks with his spirit, and both had as their origin women who accepted the calling to bear, nurture, and sustain. If Cain represents the marked man who builds cities but does not build the heart, and Seth represents the man of reconnection with God, then their wives, the destiny of these women was one of constant sacrifice, bearing children from brothers, continuing a humanity stained by sin, and building homes amid a land marked by curses, promises, and disputes. They had no choice, no laws, no alternatives, only the biological and spiritual mission to multiply life. They were the first to endure the pains of childbirth, the challenges of motherhood, and the hope of a better future born with each new child. It is possible that among these daughters there were remarkable women-wise, compassionate. According to these records, each of Adam and Eve's sons was born with a twin sister. Cain was born with Kalmana, and Abel with Baliraa. And God-fearing women who taught the first songs, the first care of the land, the first acts of faith. Although not part of the biblical canon, it collects ancient oral and written traditions from Judaism and Islam, aiming to preserve interpretations that circulated among scholars for centuries. In these sources, Baliraa and Kalmana are not mere decorative figures, but direct agents of the tension that led to humanity's first crime. The presence of these twins further reinforces the reality that Adam and Eve had multiple sons and daughters, and that the first marriages took place between siblings. The fact that these unions caused internal discord shows that even at humanity's dawn, human emotions such as jealousy, desire, and injustice were already present, capable of corrupting even the first descendants of creation. But their names were buried by tradition, hidden by the language of ancient times. We are left only to imagine how much their contribution shaped the world we know today. A world that, although it has forgotten their names, still carries the fruit of their wombs. This version indicates that as the years passed, the sisters grew up and became the designated wives for their brothers. The issue, therefore, was not only spiritual or related to the type of offering made to God, as narrated in the Bible, but also personal and familial. The dispute over a woman, combined with God's rejection of Cain's offering, created an emotionally explosive situation, an environment where honor, pride, and passion mixed with faith. However, the problem arose when Abel was blessed with Baliraa, described as more beautiful, while Cain was left with Kalmana, who was less attractive. Cain then expressed deep dissatisfaction with the choice and desired to swap wives, demanding Abel's companion for himself. This desire, however, was rejected, and resentment began to fester in Cain's heart. The love triangle, Baliraa and Kalmana, an interpretation preserved in ancient Islamic traditions and also reported in extra-biblical Hebrew texts such as the Seder. Hadaro offers a surprising perspective on the conflict between Cain and Abel. The narrative suggests these sisters were not only life companions, but also part of the drama that culminated in the first murder in human history. According to these sources, it was this love conflict that sparked envy, fueled jealousy, and intensified the tension between the brothers. The Book of Generations from Seder Hadaro, a rabbinical chronological compendium written in the 18th century, is one of the sources that records these names and circumstances. Although not part of the biblical canon, it collects ancient oral and written traditions from Judaism and Islam, aiming to preserve interpretations that circulated among scholars for centuries. In these sources, Baliraa and Kalmana are not mere decorative figures, but direct agents of the tension that led to humanity's first crime. This version of the story also helps us understand why God intervened so severely after the murder. Cain's sin was not only against Abel, but against the order established by God, who had already outlined guidelines for coexistence and marriage. By desiring his brother's wife, Cain violated not only a fraternal bond, but also the sanctity of marriage. Now, it's up to you. What do you think about this story? Do you believe the twins really existed? Do you think marriage between siblings was necessary or repulsive? Share your opinion in the comments. And if this content opened your eyes to aspects you'd never thought about before, like the video, share it, and turn on notifications. There are many more secrets hidden in the Bible's margins, and together we will reveal them. This intensified the gravity of his act, making him worthy of curse and exile. Although not found in the canonical scriptures, this tradition offers a complementary lens through which to understand the events of Genesis. It reveals that human passions, marital conflicts, and resentful jealousies have always been part of humanity's story. The presence of these twins further reinforces the reality that Adam and Eve had multiple sons and daughters, and that the first marriages took place between siblings. If today we know the names Cain, Abel, and Seth, but know almost nothing about Baliraa, Kalmana, Azura, or Awan, it is because history, like humanity, has been shaped by choices, silences, and cultural priorities. But now that you know the untold backstage, the question remains, what will you do with this knowledge? The fact that these unions caused internal discord shows that even at humanity's dawn, human emotions such as jealousy, desire, it reveals how much we have forgotten about the importance of roots, the silenced women and family conflicts that still echo today. How many times have you gone through similar conflicts where desire, jealousy, or sibling comparison causes deep divisions? And how many Kalmana and Baliraa as exist today women who bear the weight of others' choices and are pushed into anonymity? And injustice were already present, capable of corrupting even the first descendants of creation. Cain's crime in this scenario was not a sudden act, but the climax of a brewing family tragedy. Adam and Eve's daughters, like Baliraa and Kalmana, were not merely reproductive figures. They were also catalysts for events that shaped the course of human existence. This dive into humanity's origins is not just curiosity. The Bible shows us that even in the earliest families, God's justice and the consequences of our actions walk hand in hand. Now, it's up to you. What do you think about this story? Do you believe the twins really existed? Do you think marriage between siblings was necessary or repulsive? Share your opinion in the comments. And if this content opened your eyes to aspects you'd never thought about before, like the video, share it, and turn on notifications. The Bible shows us that even in the earliest families, God's justice and the consequences of our actions walk hand in hand.